London has 21 lost rivers. They still flow. We simply no longer see them. Listening to Elif Shafak, I couldn't help but wonder, are there human qualities quietly disappearing beneath the surface? Elif Shafak believes stories can take us into the mind of another human being. Elif has published 20 books globally. Her books were translated in 57 languages around the world. And she does believe that stories matter more than ever. Let's find out why. Today with Elif Shafak in conversation at the Future of Skills podcast. I'm very grateful today, guys, to introduce you on the Future of Skills podcast, someone who I've been longing to have on the podcast for quite some time, someone who I admire deeply for your deep thinking, for the books that you share with the world, for your thinking that you share with the world. So this is no other than Elif Shafak. Welcome, Elif.
Thank you so much for your very generous words, and thank you for having me.
I will make a little bit more of an intro to how we've come about the topic of today and how we want to unfold this topic later on with a little bit more detail. So Elif has spent over 2 decades exploring the emotional, the cultural, and philosophical currents that shape who we are and who are we becoming. Therefore, Elif is one of the most influential literary voices of our time, and her work spans continents, identities, and centuries. With the latest novel that we actually have here, and there will be a lucky winner who Elif will choose on the basis of the questions that have been shared with us in the community for Elif. So on the back of the book that has been written by Elif with the topic of There Are Rivers in the Sky as the title, I'd love to share with you guys that on here, the book touches on the deeper mission that we all have as humans, and therefore the discovery question that we have to all of our guests on the podcast, if that's all right, is we'd love to know how the guests are finding themselves. How would they describe themselves in 3 words of their choice, please?
That's a tough question. Only 3 words. I think I would describe myself as a storyteller, as a commuter, someone who commutes between cultures, continents, maybe, the differences. And the 3rd word, it's not 1 word, but I would call myself a citizen of humanity, I think, yeah.
Thank you very much. I can see that coming through in your work, in how you write about the reactions that we as humans portray in relation to people that we encounter on our way, in relation to the mission that we think belongs to us and how we want to unfold that. On that topic, I'll dive in a little bit deeper and I'll ask you in return if that's all right. What do you think is the deeper mission behind your own writing?
For me, writing is an existential need. I say this because this has been my experience from an early age onwards. Since I was a child, I was a very lonely child. I was raised by a single working mom and partly by my grandmother. And I was on my own for long stretches of time. Books became my friends. I loved Storyland. To me, it felt much more real and much more colorful than the real world. That's how it began. The desire to become a writer came to me much later. So I mention this because there's a very existential connection with literature. To me, it is as essential as the air we breathe, the water we need in order to survive. So when I write, I do not write with a sense of mission. I don't like it when writers try to teach or lecture or preach. But I think it is important that we chase questions, we ask questions, that we honor multiplicity, that we try to understand that we're all connected, deeply, deeply connected. Our stories, our destinies, our pasts, and our futures are connected, not only with each other as fellow human beings, but also with nature, with, a tree, a river. So nothing is small, nothing is insignificant, and we're all part of the same cycle or circle of existence. And I think literature is the best way to dismantle dualities and to remind us that we are all human.
This is so beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing. You can see how you've mentioned that there is an activity within you as the storyteller to be surrounded by questions, to be able to also find some answers. If that's okay, I'm going to dig deeper into that because it's not necessarily on the list. I haven't prepared it. But because you mentioned the question, I'm deeply passionate about our ability as humans to ask questions and then along the way, through our experience, to find some answers. From your perspective, is there any particular question that you might have not yet found the answer to?
So many questions that I have not found the answer to. And I think that to me is an important thing, to be able to say, I don't know. I haven't made up my mind yet. I'm still thinking about the subject, we live in an age of hyper-information, and we know something about everything, but that is not knowledge. I find it very important that we differentiate information from knowledge and knowledge from wisdom. So snippets of information might make us think that we know something about that subject, but actually knowledge requires slowing down, giving it more time. And I think to be able to say, I don't know, was very important for philosophers for a long time, for pre-Socratic philosophers, for Socrates himself. We have lost that ability. So coming back to literature, you don't start from a point of knowledge, but you start with a genuine, sincere curiosity, a desire to know. You put effort into it, you put your time into it, and you always keep in mind that you're a student of life.
There's always something out there to learn, to find new things. So curiosity becomes quite a trait that I believe it's brilliant for us to wish to get a little bit more deeper underneath its hood. On that part, I'd love to ask you the question of your becoming. You did mention that you grew up surrounded by books, and that was the realm where you would willingly wanted to get yourself immersed in from the early age. So you've often spoken about growing up between different worlds, both geographically, culturally, but also emotionally. And I can see in you that, person who appreciates the emotion, both as a term, but also as something that surrounds us, and it's better that it stays through with us. So looking back, what were the key moments or people that shaped your voice as a writer and as a thinker?
A beautiful question. I mean, there were so many people. Khalil Gibran, the Lebanese poet and writer, he has this interesting quote. He says, I learned kindness from unkind people. It's a very interesting quote, and he goes on. The reason why I mention it is because we don't always learn from good teachers. Sometimes we learn from bad teachers as well. But in terms of good teachers, I think my grandmother was a big influence on my life, my journey as a writer. My maternal grandmother was a bit of a storyteller herself. She was not a very well-educated woman, only because she had been pulled out of school for being a girl in Turkey at the time. And she wholeheartedly believed in women's education and supported her own daughter's independence and education. And that really, really changed our lives. I'm a big believer in sisterhood. I think when and if women support each other, particularly at difficult turning points in our lives, the impact of that support, the impact of that solidarity and sisterhood goes beyond generations.
Oh, wonderful. I think now that you're talking about your grandmother, I've seen potentially some connection to that in the story of The Rivers in the Sky, where you were depicting, a grandmother who was talking to Naren was the name, wasn't she? And she was teaching Naren about the various traditions, about the various ways of her connecting to the nature as well along the river Tigris. But she used to be that pillar for her of someone who had this story behind her, and she told her in the book you've depicted that story about creation as well, and the fact that God at some point stepped over the pearl, and the pearl was well protected in a safe mode and a safe space, and then he stepped over it, and then everything became fragmented at the same time, well connected. But that's how existence started, and that was probably also, you mentioned, her most favorite story. So I want to ask on that note, is there any particular favorite story that your grandma might have told you back then that you still reconnect with?
There were so many stories, but she didn't tell them in a way like as if as if it was something different than daily life.
Yeah.
So she didn't say, okay, now I'm going to tell you an important story or a parable and I'm going to teach you something. It wasn't like that. Stories were a very organic part of daily life. And I think I grew up observing these women who would maybe tell me the ballads, the folk tales, the legends of Anatolia, the Middle East, the Levant, the Balkans, because many of these stories travel across borders. And I appreciated that world. I also observed how superstitions were important for them. For instance, I've never looked down upon that world. And to the best of my ability, I would love my fiction to be a bridge builder between written culture and oral culture. Of course, I'm very attached to the Western novel as a canon. I love it. It's shaped me. It made me who I am in so many ways. But that is not the only tradition of storytelling that I feel attached to. I'm also attached to these other traditions, which is perhaps a little bit more cyclical, like stories within stories, like in 1001 Nights. It's a very different way of storytelling. I also feel very emotionally connected to that land. And I try not to forget that depending on where you are in the world or whom you're talking to, there are different ways of telling a story. That plurality is important for me.
Oh, beautiful. I have stories myself. When growing up, and I find the parallel, my grandma used to be the one who taught me the language that I didn't know anything about. It was a completely new language that I had to learn from scratch. And we were surrounded by stories as well. So for us, telling stories or hearing about various folkloric influence would be very important. Mm-hmm. Was there any particular hero that resonated with you from all those stories, or something that you would say, oh, I remember, for instance, in Romanian folklore, Ileana Costizeanu is someone who people would relate to her for her beauty and wisdom at some point. In Russian folklore, that would be Elena Prekrasna, who would be, again, a similar character to Ileana Costizeanu, because they would be both beautiful, but at the same time, they would be the pillar of wisdom for women in those lands. Would there be anything similar that would connect to?
Yes, that really resonates with me. I think I've always liked characters that were not perfect necessarily, but that were ready to learn, change, grow, and maybe at the end of the story came back wiser and stronger. That always appealed to me. I like the character of Shehrazad in 1001 Nights because via her storytelling with the power of words, she saves not only herself, but women. And so words are treated almost like magic. I like these old stories that talk about there's a magic mountain called Kaf, and that is where all the stories come from. But basically, I think I love how stories travel beyond borders. And I was also interested in how memory was preserved. The collective memory was preserved in these folk tales, in these legends. Sometimes the things that written culture conveniently forgets is still remembered in oral culture. So when you talk to grandmothers, grandfathers, they will tell you things that official history might have left out. That was also very interesting to me.
And this sounds like a seed that keeps growing with us who will remember and pass it on to the younger generations. With that in mind, talking about the younger generations today, and we will return a little bit into the memory element of the storytelling, which I find fascinating because there is a remark that you mentioned about Klimash of Nepal in your story, which I found, that's interesting, just to think about how he would conquer the other nations and where his most important values would come from in the process of conquering. We'll go into that. With regards to the younger generations today, what are some of the deepest complexities they're facing, do you think?
I honestly think it's a very difficult age for young people. There's so much pressure on their shoulders. They have to deal with so much, a lot of uncertainty. Imagine, we talk about our grandmothers. They, of course, went through immense difficulties and hardships. But generation after generation retains the hope or the optimism that tomorrow would be better than yesterday or could be better. That if you gave your children better education, they would have better lives than the life you had. And that expectation, that hope has been shattered. So with climate crisis, with AI accelerating, with financial crisis, political turbulence, and so on, it is very difficult to find people who trust that tomorrow will be better than yesterday. It is difficult to find people who believe that, well, if my children get better education, their lives will be more secure than mine, because even the job market is changing in a very radical way. So that ambiguity, that uncertainty is already challenging enough. And maybe one other thing we do, particularly as immigrants, with good intentions, but we put perhaps unnecessary pressure on our youngsters, and they grow up thinking that they are representing something bigger than themselves. Maybe they think they're representing their community, their ethnicity, their background, their identity. So they're afraid of making mistakes. They're afraid of failing. But I think in life we learn a lot from our failures. So we need to allow young people to also fail and not be harsh on that.
Thank you for saying that. I resonate with that. I can see where you're coming from. And I believe that the younger generations, as you said yourself, they have this strain on their shoulders, this unseen before pressure, both from within, probably from the family environment, as you said, the immigrant sort of influence that we have, that we believe that we can do better by learning more. But at the same time is the society pressure and the changes that we're navigating through. And talking about the changes that we're navigating through, the topic of today's discussion as well is circled around your saying of the 3 A's. You did mention that living in the age of anxiety, anger, and AI is where we are finding ourselves as humanity currently here and now. But you also warned us about apathy. Do you think that apathy is a response to overwhelm? And why do you feel that this is the biggest concern?
Yes, I think, as you kindly mentioned, we are living in the age of 3 A's. It's an age of anger. There's a lot of anger. There's a lot of anxiety. It's almost like an existential angst that cuts very deep. And I believe almost everyone is affected by this, young and old, east and west. Maybe the only difference is some people hide their emotions more than others. That is the only difference. And then there's, of course, the age of AI, which we are only at the beginning of. So we haven't quite figured out the age that we have entered, because this exponential growth is happening with such speed that our minds don't run as fast as that. Our laws don't change as fast as that. So there's a gap, and there's a lot of unknown, which increases the anxiety. So all of that makes it not an easy age to be part of. However, my point is, if this were to become the age of 4 A's, meaning if apathy were to be added into the equation, I really think it would become a much more dangerous world to live in. What I mean by that is the moment we become numb, the moment we become indifferent, desensitized, and disconnected, the moment we become atomized individuals, so much so that what someone else goes through in another part of the world or on my own street is no concern of mine. The moment we stop caring, I think that is a very, very dangerous threshold. I would like to hope and believe that art, particularly literature, is the antidote to numbness. Because what stories do, very gently but very passionately, they hold our hands and take us into the psyche of another human being. And they help us to see the world through their eyes, their perspective. We become one with someone else. That is a very humbling exercise for the ego. We all have a very inflated ego, understandably. In our daily lives, we're constantly rushing, looking at the world from our own window. But when we read a story, we become someone else. And that's why I think we need to make that journey as often as we can. And that's how we gain the ability to empathize with another human being.
Thank you so much for the answer. I'm very grateful. Also because going back to the questions that we receive from the community, there is one in particular that I would read from Argiri. she did mention something in that realm. She said, in a world where misogyny is the topic that she's raised, is becoming louder and more emboldened, do you think storytelling still has the power to change minds, what you were referring to? Or are we at the point where fiction can only speak to those who already believe in women's humanity?
Beautiful question. I think it's a little bit unfortunate that in the English language in particular, we use the word fiction as if it were the opposite of fact or reality. And many people, understandably, because of that definition, they assume that if you want to escape the harshness of reality, you can escape into a novel. I disagree with that. I disagree with that because I think fiction is very interested in truth. I think fiction brings us closer to truth, brings us closer to this age we're living in and to humanity, but it does it in its own gentle and passionate way. Now, coming back to the very thoughtful and nuanced question that our audience member asked, I also share her concern about the misogyny, the sexism that we see around the world, which is unfortunately being deepened by AI models and algorithms in particular, so we need to understand the responsibility of social media in all this. Of course, literature cannot stop wars, literature cannot stop violence, or cannot change extremist ideologies wholesale. But I think what literature can do is to keep the flame of solidarity, humanity, empathy, wisdom alive, the seeds alive. And from those seeds, trees grow, forests grow. So it's important that we don't lose these things. And we often find the bridge builders in the world of art and literature.
Thank you. I can't find words to describe the gratitude, particularly with what you mentioned around the seeds growing into trees, because here's where I can see the force emerging from, and how each of us had access to those seeds. It's more of a case of digging under, isn't it? And trying to get that curiosity alive. And the term of aliveness that you mentioned yourself, probably that's the antidote to the apathy that you've shared at the beginning of the interaction, isn't it? Is that part.
I so appreciate that you mentioned this. Each and every one of us, we have those seeds. Absolutely. And the French philosopher Voltaire, he used to talk about cultivating our inner garden. I like that expression very much. I think there are 3 urgent connections that we need to rebuild in an age as debilitating, as confusing as this. The first connection is the one we build with our fellow human beings, beyond boxes, beyond tribes, and beyond borders. The second connection that I find very important is the one we build with nature. We're not above nature. We're not, the cleverest species. We're just a very humble part of a very delicate ecosystem. So we have to redefine our relationship with nature and stop seeing ourselves as just consumers of earth and water and air. And the third connection that I find very important is the inner one. I don't have a word for that. Some people call it spirituality. Other people call it meditation. Voltaire called it the inner garden. Maybe I will follow his footsteps. But I believe we all have an inner garden that we are responsible for. And we need to take good care of that.
Oh, brilliant. It reminds me of, children when they only appear into this world, they have this little bit of a gap at the very, top of. And in Russian language, there is this saying that, up until the moment when it gets already not that soft but hardens, that's when you kind of, you almost step fully into the new world, but you leave behind that seed of spirituality that if you haven't connected with, it's a little bit more of a thinking then it might not necessarily grow over time as easily. So we kind of, at the very beginning, I think that's the morale there, is that we'll have that connection. It's more of a case of how it and what it grows into over time.
Yes, this is so interesting. I mean, many oral stories and many mystical traditions actually say the same thing across centuries, beyond geographical borders. People who have never seen each other, never met each other. Maybe someone in 14th century one part of the world, someone in 17th century in a completely different continent. I'm always intrigued by those similarities. But basically what they're telling us is this notion of oneness, that there was a time, perhaps, when we were one, when we were much more connected. There was no us versus them, and then everything was shattered. Can we go back to that feeling of oneness? It's an interesting, maybe mystical question. But I've always believed literature responds to that question. There are two different, perhaps, pillars or two different facets of literature. One is much more autobiographical, and I have a lot of respect for that. But I think it's very important that people are able to write their stories. Maya Angelou talked about this. She said, there's no greater pain than not being able to share your own story. So I have a lot of respect for that. But that's only one side of literature. The other side of literature, in my opinion, is not autobiographical, but it is transcendental. The moment we transcend the self that is given to us by birth, right? Our own little corner of the universe, we try to go beyond that, and we become another person, someone else, to such an extent that we realize the person we saw as our other is actually not a different species, is maybe my brother, is my sister, I am the other, So there's no duality anymore. I'm always intrigued by that transcendental nature of literature.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you so much for this, because you share the connection of and the tools that literature might bring in so that we don't forget. So in the book, you're saying a king knows that you must capture not only its land, which we talked about, the territory, but its collective imagination. So not just the memory, but also collective imagination, which I find amazing that you mentioned. So what do you think is shaping our collective imagination today?
Yeah, beautiful question. And if I may share maybe a small example,
Please, yeah.
Apologies, it's not a small example, but if I may take it out back, if I may share with you an example, just perhaps to clarify what I mean by that. When ISIS launched the genocide against the Yazidi minorities in the Middle East, and let us not forget that the Yazidi lore talks about 72 massacres throughout history. Remembering, date by date, the memory is kept in oral storytelling. So the 73rd one happened in the eyes of, before the eyes of the world, but maybe not many people noticed that the very first thing that the fanatics did was to kill the water. So they poisoned the fountains, they poisoned the wells, leaving no drinkable water for entire communities. The second thing they did, and I think it's relevant for our discussion, very deliberately, in my opinion, was to kill the elderly. Now, in a community like the Yazidis, in which memory is transmitted not via written culture, but via oral storytelling, and that is where the collective identity resides. If you kill the elderly, you are killing collective memory, and you're killing identity. And then they killed defenseless men, and they kidnapped women and children. As we're speaking, there are still more than 3,000 missing. So throughout history, we have seen this pattern repeated by many, many extremists. Collective memory is an important part of human identity. Stories, legends, they make us who we are, and they transmit the wisdom of generations to the next generation. So I don't think it's a coincidence that, unfortunately, many people with expansionist ambitions throughout history, going all the way back to Ashurbanipal, they have repeated this pattern. Yes, they conquer the land, but the very next thing they do is to attack the collective memory.
This is not only sad, but it also shows us all of the facets of the human nature, the good and the bad at the same time. When it comes to the bad, you've mentioned yourself, it's this magical part of it, which is almost like an existential rebirth, or a rhapsody, as I would call it, of an existential rebirth. Is because you've described there how repeatedly a drop, transforms, and then how it lives throughout eons of eternity, and it's still there with us. So it's witnessing all of the events, all of the crudities, all of the abolitions of identities that are being stamped across the eons but also it's not only an observer in that way. Talking about that and the fact that stories persist through water that has memory, and here I think in the book you also mentioned the role that Zulekha, if I'm not mistaken, in terms of the pronunciation, she used to be the water memory keeper in that sense. So scientists who actually specialized in that note in particular. How would you see that part of the keeping of the knowledge through understanding something as perennial as water?
I'm always interested in how families that have experienced some kind of complexity, displacement, trauma, families or communities that come from complicated pasts, how they deal with memory. And I think depending on which generation you focus on, there are some subtle differences. Usually the elderly are the ones who have experienced the biggest hardships, but interestingly, they do not talk about the past. They don't even have a language for that. It doesn't mean they have forgotten. It just means it sits inside their chests, unspoken, all that knowledge and memory. The second generation usually is not that interested in the past, and we need to understand them as well because they have to build a new life. Tabula rasa, they need to find their feet. But that leaves the third or the fourth generations, the youngest in these families or communities, I believe, are the ones who are doing the memory keeping today. So you might meet a young person who's carrying old memories because they are the ones who are asking the deepest questions about not only family stories, but also family silences. I would like to hope and believe that writers are the memory keepers of their societies, of their era. About the Zulekha character in the novel, I so appreciate the question. As you mentioned, she's a water scientist who also studies invisible rivers, lost rivers, buried rivers. As you know, the biggest rivers on our planet are the invisible ones above our heads. There are big atmospheric rivers. We don't see them, but they're there. And then there are many buried rivers or lost rivers under our feet. We don't see them, but they are there. London has 21 lost rivers. Across the world, in every continent, there are buried rivers. From Tokyo to Moscow to Stuttgart. There isn't a single continent that, I can think of at this moment that doesn't have them in a way. And the interesting thing is, as humanity, what we have done is as we built our civilizations, we called some rivers either unnecessary, insignificant, too dirty, too filthy, and we built entire cities and buildings above them. Now, with the sea levels rising, that system is not sustainable anymore, and we are seeing more and more flash floods in our big cities because those buried rivers cannot carry this much water. So now there's an awareness in the world. For instance, in South Korea, there are very important examples of this in Seoul. There's an awareness that talks about bringing buried rivers into daylight. It's called daylighting. To me, it's an important metaphor, and I want to ask, what else remains buried in our lives? Can we bring them to daylight? Can we talk about them? I think the job of a novelist is a bit like that.
That's beautiful. I do think so much about this story, about the awareness that you're raising, about the importance of water and what it carries within, because that's what we drink, that's what we're made of.
That's what we're made of. Indeed, yes. It's our main element.
We might have sort of touched base on it already. So it says, do you think technological advancement is inevitable? And if so, what we as humans risk losing in exchange of convenience, which automation happily provides us with?
Yeah, this is such a great question. And really, it is going to become one of the most important questions of our age. I do not want to claim that all technology is bad or all AI is bad. It's not like that. I think it's much more complicated than that. It's a bit like the moon, isn't it? I mean, it does have a bright side, and we need to understand and appreciate that, but it does have a very dark side as well. And because we haven't talked about the dangerous side of technology enough, it is vital that we do so urgently now. And we need to be engaged in this conversation as citizens of humanity. I think technology is way too important to leave it just to tech companies. I personally would not want any politician, any political party, or any company to have absolute power. We're all human beings. We're all fallible creatures. We make mistakes. We balance each other. We teach each other. So we need separation of powers. We need checks and balances. A monopolization of power is not a healthy thing, in my opinion. Coming back to technology, what are the promising aspects? For instance, in medicine, the advancement that the new AI technologies might bring is really, really important and crucial. And that might be very good for humanity. What are the danger sites? For instance, the spread of misinformation, disinformation, hate speech, how we have become addicted to rage, those clickbaits. Everything, all the algorithms are now depend on, even when you read the captions under YouTube videos, it's like so and so pummeled, pulverized, crushed, demolished, destroyed the other person. I just pay attention to those verbs that are used. That is not a proper intellectual exchange. An intellectual exchange doesn't mean you pulverize, you destroy the other person. I think a proper intellectual exchange means, here I am, I have my convictions, I have my beliefs, but I am here and my door is not closed to you. I'm here to also listen to you. And if what you tell me, what you're saying to me makes sense to me, I am ready to revise my opinions and my convictions. So it is not a conversation between clashing certainties in which it's not a boxing match, that's not a proper intellectual exchange. That's something we have lost. And I also want to remind people that something we are losing is there are different types of intelligence. Nobody is intelligent on every front. For instance, there are people who have an amazing numerical intelligence or an amazing intelligence in one area, but perhaps their emotional intelligence is very low. Why? Because they haven't developed that. They haven't put thought into that. And then there's something called metacognition. That is when we think about our thinking, when we revise our own convictions, when we remember that we should always have an element of doubt, rethink about what we are saying. These are the things that we are losing in the age of AI, and that worries me.
Thank you for this answer. I deeply resonate with what you're saying, also for the sake of the younger generations who need to get closer to the skills that, as you said yourself, that we're seeming to be drifting away from, especially the critical thinking that you're alluding to. On that note, and in terms of the closer feel for what comes our way, I'd like to, first off, very grateful for our discussion today.
Likewise.
And it leads me into that feel for what comes our way. And this is our flash Q&A, which we'll wrap up the discussion with. So please kindly let us know from your perspective something that intuitively comes through. And there will be a few questions. Ready to go?
Perfect. Yes.
Excellent. So the first one, please. How would you define the term magic?
I think magic is part of life. That's why I don't like the term magical realism, because it presumes that magic is a separate box and then reality is a separate box. I think there are no boxes in this moment. In every moment in life, there's an element of magic.
I do believe in that. We're having this discussion, so that's magic as well for me. Excellent. How would you define the term reality?
Equally, I wouldn't divorce it from magic. I wouldn't divorce it from the surreal. I think reality is always much more complicated. There are layers, but all I can very quickly add is that without a story, there is no proper understanding. Truth lives inside a story. If we don't know people's story, we only think of them as categories, as numbers, as abstractions. That is not reality. So for me, reality doesn't exist without stories.
Grateful, thank you. What emotion do you believe modern society most avoids feeling?
Oh, there are so many emotions. Vulnerability and emotions in general are regarded as a sign of weakness. which puts unnecessary pressure on young people. It puts unnecessary pressure, particularly on women, also on women politicians, for instance. I mean, women who exist in a men's world are much more susceptible to this. We have to remember that emotions are not a sign of weakness. They're all sources of raw energy. So the question is, what do we do with that raw energy? But vulnerability is something we find very difficult to talk about in modern societies, and we all have it because we're all human.
Thank you so much, Elif. I'll dig under the term raw energy because I love it. And I won't keep too many questions because you've been a fountain of knowledge with your answers. Thank you so much. But the one that I keep very close to is this particular question. What do humans most urgently need to remember?
I think humans need to urgently remember that we are all connected. There are no hierarchies. Nobody's inferior, nobody's superior. And we have an amazing blend of contrasts. On the one hand, we can be very vulnerable. We can show, lots of bruises and scars we carry with ourselves. That is human. On the other hand, we have an amazing ability for renewal, for resilience. And that also makes us who we are. So to honor that complexity, that plurality, both within and also within our societies, to me is very important.
Elif, thank you so much for this experience. Highly grateful.
I am so grateful, really. I appreciate it so much. Thank you.
And shaking your hand in return.
Thank you so much.